Montana Territory, 1875. The vast expanse of Big Sky country stretched before Xavier Caldwell as he stood on the porch of his lonely cabin, watching the horizon with weary blue eyes that had seen too much for his 25 years. The setting sun painted the distant mountains purple and gold, a beauty that felt wasted on a solitary soul. His ranch, hard-won through 5 years of backbreaking labor after the war, sprawled across 300 acres of prime grassland, yet remained as empty as his heart. A man's meant to ride alone out here, Xavier muttered to himself, a mantra he'd repeated since burying his parents after a Sioux raid when he was just 17. The frontier takes everything you love eventually. His ranch hands had departed weeks ago, driving his cattle to market in Billings, leaving Xavier to tend the homestead alone. The silence pressed in around him like a physical thing. At night, he'd catch himself talking to his horse just to hear a voice. 25 years old, and already he felt ancient, hardened by a land that gave nothing without taking something in return. What Xavier wanted was simple: to build a profitable ranch, keep himself alive, and avoid the complications that came with depending on others. What he refused to acknowledge was his desperate need for connection, for someone who wouldn't leave when winter came, or when bandits threatened, or when the land turned mean. As darkness fell, Xavier retreated inside his cabin, more house than home despite the craftsmanship he'd poured into every beam and board. On the table sat an opened letter from his cousin in St. Louis, urging him once again to find a wife before the frontier dries you up inside, Xav. Beside it lay a folded newspaper advertisement he'd been avoiding for days, circled in his cousin's handwriting. Mail-order brides. Respectable women seeking Western husbands. Damn fool notion, Xavier said to the empty room, yet his fingers traced the words before he could stop himself. The following morning, Xavier rode into the dusty settlement of White Rock, ostensibly for supplies, but the letter he carried burned in his pocket. 3 months earlier, in a moment of whiskey-induced weakness, he had responded to the advertisement. Now, a reply waited at the general store, according to the message delivered by a passing rider. "Package came for you, Caldwell," Abner Thompson, the storekeeper, called out as Xavier entered. "And this letter? Fancy handwriting. From back east." Xavier accepted the envelope with feigned indifference, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Later, alone on the trail home, he finally broke the seal. The letter was from a Miss Nora Valenti, age 22, responding to his inquiry. Her elegant script described a life in Boston that had dissolved with her parents' passing, leaving her alone with few prospects. What caught Xavier's attention, however, was not her circumstances but the postscript, written in a different hand, her chaperone aunt's. "Miss Valenti wishes to be forthright that she cannot speak. An illness in childhood took her voice, though her hearing remains perfect. She communicates through sign language and writing. If this presents an obstacle to your interest, please advise promptly." Xavier stared at the words, something unexpected stirring in his chest. A woman who couldn't speak. A silence different from his own. That evening, he sat at his table for hours, drafting and redrafting his response. When dawn broke, he had his answer. "Your silence is no obstacle, Miss Valenti. The Montana Territory speaks loudly enough for both of us." 6 weeks later, Xavier stood on the platform of the White Rock station, watching the train from the east pull in with a screech of metal and billowing steam. His palms sweated inside leather gloves despite the October chill. He'd shaved that morning, trimmed his sandy hair, and donned his only good shirt beneath a vest his mother had made years ago. Among the few passengers who disembarked, she was impossible to miss. Nora Valenti stood hesitantly on the platform, a vision in a practical blue traveling dress that nonetheless highlighted a slender waist and graceful posture. Her chestnut hair was swept up beneath a modest hat, framing a face that struck Xavier with its quiet beauty, high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes the color of spring leaves. At 22, she carried herself with a dignity beyond her years, though Xavier could see the nervousness in how she clutched her small valise. "Miss Valenti?" Xavier approached, removing his hat. "Xavier Caldwell." Her eyes widened slightly, taking in his 6-foot frame, the breadth of his shoulders beneath the vest, the weathered tan of his face that contrasted with eyes as blue as Montana's summer sky. A smile, tentative but genuine, curved her lips. She set down her bag and her hands moved in a graceful sequence Xavier couldn't understand. He stood awkwardly, suddenly aware of the gulf between them. I don't know your signs. Nora nodded as if expecting this, reaching into her reticule to produce a small slate and chalk. Quickly, she wrote, I am pleased to meet you, Mr. Caldwell. Thank you for meeting me. The pleasure's mine, Xavier replied, feeling strangely tongue-tied for a man who'd faced down rustlers and blizzards without flinching. Let me get your trunks. As they rode in his wagon toward town, Xavier had arranged a room for her at the boarding house until they could determine if they suited. He found himself talking more than he had in months. He pointed out landmarks, explained the seasons in Montana, described his ranch. Nora listened intently, occasionally writing brief questions on her slate. The Reverend's wife, Mrs. Peterson, will be your chaperone at the boarding house, Xavier explained as they approached White Rock. She's agreed to help us. Well, to see if we might suit each other. Before any decisions are made. Nora wrote, I would like to learn about you and your life here. I hope you will also wish to learn about me. Something in her direct gaze, lacking the artifice he'd seen in other women, made Xavier nod. I would, Miss Valenti. Very much. Over the following weeks, Xavier found himself riding into town nearly every day, ostensibly on ranch business, but always ending up at the Peterson home where Nora boarded. Mrs. Peterson, a kindly woman in her 50s, supervised their meetings while teaching Xavier the rudimentary finger alphabet. A, B, C. Xavier practiced awkwardly, his calloused fingers struggling with the delicate shapes. Nora's silent laughter, her shoulders shaking and eyes crinkling, somehow filled the room more completely than any sound could have. On his third visit, Nora presented him with a gift, a small book of common signs she'd illustrated herself. Xavier was struck by her artistic talent, the precise drawings showing hands forming words he would need. Water, horse, cattle, house, hungry, tired. This is remarkable, he said, genuinely impressed. You drew these yourself? She nodded, a becoming blush coloring her cheeks as she took back her slate. I have always drawn. It became more important after I lost my voice at age 8. Scarlet fever. Xavier found himself sharing more than he intended about his own past, his parents' deaths, the struggle to hold onto the ranch against rustlers and harsh winters, his determination to make something lasting in this wild country. I haven't been entirely honest, Miss Valenti, he admitted one afternoon as they walked through town, Mrs. Peterson following at a discreet distance. I wrote to you believing I needed a practical arrangement, someone to help with the household while I built my ranch. But I'm finding myself. He trailed off, unaccustomed to expressing such thoughts. Nora stopped, looking up at him with those clear green eyes. She wrote carefully, We all need more than practicality, Mr. Caldwell, even in this harsh land, perhaps especially here. The words struck Xavier like a physical blow. He'd convinced himself that emotional attachments were dangerous in frontier country, that caring too deeply only made the inevitable losses harder to bear. Yet this woman who communicated without sound somehow spoke directly to the loneliness he'd denied for years. As autumn deepened, Xavier began bringing Nora to his ranch for properly chaperoned day visits. He showed her the house he'd built, larger than a bachelor needed, with rooms that had waited empty for a future he hadn't dared imagine. Nora moved through the spaces with appreciative eyes, running her fingers along the woodwork he'd carved himself. On the slate, she wrote, You have built something beautiful here, but it needs life within its walls. That evening, as Xavier drove her back to town, Nora suddenly touched his arm. When he looked over, she was making a gesture he recognized from their lessons, her hand at her chest, then extending toward him. The sign for thank you. Then, slowly, deliberately, she made another sequence, her fist over her heart, then crossing her arms over her chest, pointing finally to him. Xavier pulled the wagon to a stop, his heart racing. What does that mean? Nora took out her slate, but instead of writing an explanation, she simply drew the sequence. I love you. The next morning, Xavier woke before dawn, his mind made up. He rode to town and spoke with Reverend Peterson, then visited the town's only jewelry shop. By midday, he stood in the Petersons' parlor, hat in hand, as Nora entered the room. Miss Valenti, Nora, he began, his voice steadier than he expected. I came to Montana believing that a man survives by keeping to himself, by not needing anyone. I thought needing was weakness. He took a breath. I was wrong. We're not meant to face this frontier alone. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a simple gold band. I can't offer you an easy life. The winters are brutal, the work never ends, and there's 100 ways the land tests you daily. But I can offer you honesty, protection, and a heart that's learning, thanks to you, how to hope again. Xavier knelt, the gesture awkward but sincere. Nora Valenti, will you marry me? For a long moment, Nora simply stared at him, tears gathering in her eyes. Then her hands moved, forming the sequence she had shown him the previous evening. I love you, followed by an emphatic nod. They were married 2 weeks later in the small white church of White Rock. November had arrived with the threat of early snow, but the day dawned clear and bright. Xavier stood at the altar in a new suit, watching as Nora walked toward him in a cream-colored dress, her chestnut hair adorned with small white flowers. Mrs. Peterson had helped arrange a ceremony accommodating Nora's silence, with the Reverend guiding her through written responses. When it came time for the vows, Xavier spoke his clearly, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. When her turn came, she surprised everyone, including Xavier. Her hands moved in a series of signs, and then she pulled a folded paper from her sleeve, handing it to the Reverend. Mrs. Caldwell has asked me to read her vows, Reverend Peterson announced, unfolding the paper. She has been practicing them in sign, which she has just shown to her husband, and wishes the words shared with all present. Xavier, I crossed a continent to find a place to belong. In your letters, I glimpsed a man of honor and strength, but I feared my silence would build walls between us. Instead, you have shown me that true communication needs no voice, only an open heart. I promise to fill our home with love that needs no words, to stand beside you through winter storms and summer drought, to create a life where neither of us walks alone again. This I vow, with hands that speak what my voice cannot. There wasn't a dry eye in the church as Xavier slipped the ring onto Nora's finger. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. He gathered her gently in his arms, whispering against her lips, I love you too, before sealing their union with a kiss that promised everything words could not express. Winter arrived in earnest as Xavier brought his bride home to the ranch. The first heavy snow fell on their wedding night, transforming the landscape into a glistening white expanse that stretched to the horizon. Inside the cabin, a fire roared in the hearth as Xavier carried Nora across the threshold. Welcome home, Mrs. Caldwell, he said, setting her down carefully. Nora moved through the house with newfound ownership, lighting lamps against the early darkness. When she turned back to Xavier, her hands formed the signs for our home, with such joy that he felt his chest tighten with emotion. That night, as snow whispered against the windows, Xavier discovered that love required no words at all. Nora's touch spoke volumes, her silent gasps and the eloquence of her body communicating more clearly than speech ever could. Afterward, as she lay in his arms, she traced letters on his chest. HOME. The weeks that followed tested their new union as Montana winter unleashed its full fury. Blizzards howled around their cabin, temperatures plunged, and the work of keeping livestock alive became an endless battle. Xavier would return from the barn, half frozen, to find Nora waiting with hot coffee and a fire stoked high. She proved remarkably adaptable to ranch life, learning quickly how to manage the household through the harsh season. For Christmas, Xavier surprised Nora by unveiling a room he'd secretly prepared, a small studio with north-facing windows, an easel he'd commissioned from the town carpenter, and art supplies ordered from St. Louis. Nora's face illuminated with joy as she explored the space, turning to him with hands that rapidly signed her gratitude. I thought you might teach art to the children in town come spring, Xavier said. And perhaps you could paint some scenes of the ranch. Make it truly ours. Nora's gift to him was equally thoughtful, a leather-bound book in which she'd carefully written the most important signs, illustrated with her drawings, and including stories of her life before Montana. Xavier spent hours poring over it, finally seeing the full woman he'd married, her childhood in Boston, her dreams, her losses, her journey to him. As January deepened, Xavier faced his greatest fear. Returning from checking fence lines, he found Nora pale and feverish, burning with an illness that had swept through town. For 3 days and nights, he barely slept, sponging her forehead with cool water, praying to a god he'd nearly forgotten. On the 3rd night, when her fever finally broke, Xavier laid his head on their bed and wept with relief. "I thought I was losing you," he confessed when she woke, her eyes clear again though her body was weak. "And I realized that all those years of telling myself I didn't need anyone were a lie I told out of fear. I need you, Nora. More than this ranch, more than anything." Nora's hands, still shaky from illness, formed the sign for stay followed by forever. February brought a new challenge. A band of rustlers, taking advantage of the isolated ranches, began hitting properties throughout the valley. Xavier rode with a hastily formed posse, leaving Nora alone for 3 days with only their foreman's wife for company. When they tracked the rustlers to their camp, a firefight ensued. Xavier took a bullet that grazed his shoulder before the county sheriff and his men arrived to help capture the gang. Returning home wounded, Xavier found Nora white-faced with worry, but steady in tending his injury. As she cleaned and bandaged him, her hands occasionally strayed to his face, touching him as if to reassure herself he was truly there. That night, she held him with fierce possessiveness, and Xavier understood that her love was as protective as his own. The rustlers' capture brought unexpected consequences. Their leader, being transported to the territorial prison, escaped near White Rock. Somehow learning that Xavier had been key in tracking them, he made his way to the Caldwell ranch seeking revenge. Xavier and Nora were eating breakfast when the man burst through their door, pistol drawn, face twisted with hatred. "You cost me everything, Caldwell," he snarled. "Now I'm taking something of yours." Nora stood frozen as the gun swung toward her. Xavier lunged across the table, but knew he wouldn't reach her in time. In that suspended moment, Nora's hands moved, not in fear, but in a deliberate pattern. The rustler hesitated, confused by her gestures. That split second was all Xavier needed to tackle him, sending the gun spinning across the floor. The ensuing struggle was brutal but brief. When it ended, Xavier had the man securely bound with rope from the barn. The sheriff, alerted by their foreman who had witnessed the rustler's approach, arrived within the hour to take him away. "What did you sign to him?" Xavier asked afterward, holding Nora's trembling hands. It made him hesitate. She reached for her slate. "I told him I forgave him." It was the last thing he expected. As spring slowly reclaimed the land, Xavier watched his wife blossom along with the landscape. Nora started teaching art to the children in town once a week, her slate and gestures somehow more effective than words with the youngsters, who adored her. She began painting scenes of the ranch that captured not just its physical beauty, but its spirit, the freedom and possibility Xavier had always felt there. Their home transformed under her touch. Curtains appeared at windows, quilts brightened the furniture, and flowers filled vases once the meadows bloomed. More profoundly, laughter filled rooms that had known only silence. Xavier found himself telling stories in the evenings, tales of his childhood or amusing incidents with the cattle, while Nora's silent laughter shook her shoulders and lit her eyes. On a warm evening in late May, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains, Nora took Xavier's hand and placed it gently on her stomach, her eyes asking a question. Xavier stared at her, understanding dawning slowly. "Are you certain?" Nora nodded, her smile radiant as her hands formed the signs they had created together, a blend of conventional sign language and their own private gestures. "Our family grows." Xavier gathered her into his arms, overwhelmed by a joy he once would have found terrifying. Now, it felt like the natural extension of the love that had transformed his life. "I used to believe the frontier was no place for love," he whispered against her hair. "That caring for someone out here was just asking for heartbreak. But you've shown me that love doesn't make us vulnerable. It makes us stronger. The frontier demands everything we have, but together, we have more to give." Nora leaned back, her hands forming the signs he'd come to cherish above all others. "I love you." Xavier's fingers, once clumsy but now fluent in the language of her heart, signed back. "I love you too." As darkness settled over the Montana prairie, stars emerged in the vast sky above their home. Xavier Caldwell, once the lonely cowboy who believed himself destined to ride alone, held his wife close, feeling the future stirring beneath his palm. Their love, born in silence yet speaking volumes, had not just survived the frontier, it had conquered it, proving that even in the wildest places, two hearts could find their way home to each other.